For 3 days, an abandoned orc slept on a station bench while everyone pretended not to see her. What she never expected was that a quiet rancher she'd never met would become the greatest blessing of her life. The Oakhaven station had been forgotten by the world. No important train had passed through in days. Dust gathered on the rails like a slow, grey snow. The wind moved through empty platforms, carrying nothing but silence and the smell of dry wood. On a splintered bench sat a woman the town pretended not to see. Her skin was a soft emerald green. Her ears tapered to delicate points beneath a curtain of black hair, tangled now from days of travel. Her name was Grenda, and she had been waiting for 3 days. She did not know how to stop waiting. Hope was a stubborn thing, even when it cost her strength to hold on to it. Each hour that passed took a small piece of her certainty with it, like water wearing down stone. Pressed against her chest was a worn leather pouch. Inside, a single piece of paper, its ink faded almost to nothing. An address, a promise. The last thread connecting her to the future she had once believed in. She thought of the food she no longer had. On the journey she had given the last of her bread to a hungry child traveling with his mother. She remembered the boy's small hands, how grateful he had looked. She did not regret it even now, with her stomach hollow and her body trembling from hunger. Blackwood, the town beyond the station, did not care. Humans and orcs walked its streets together, ordinary as any crowd, and yet no one looked twice at the woman wasting away on the bench. No one offered bread, no one offered a roof. Sheriff Miller passed by on his morning rounds. He slowed his horse, studying her for a long moment. The hollow cheeks, the dust-stained dress, the eyes that no longer lifted to meet his. He understood enough. He rode on anyway. The town began to whisper instead of help. Some said a man had abandoned her. Others said she had brought trouble to Blackwood, the way storms followed bad luck. None of them asked her name. She had come for a man named Julian Cross. For months, his letters had arrived like small gifts, promises of a home, a future, a husband who would love her. She had read them until the paper softened at the folds. She had believed every word, because believing was easier than being alone. Now the platform was empty, except for her. The sun rose and fell 3 times, and still no one came. She watched the road stretch toward the horizon, waiting for a shape that never appeared. On the 3rd night, the cold settled deep into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, around the pouch, around the last fragile pieces of her hope. Somewhere far away, a coyote called into the dark, and she wondered, not for the first time, if anyone in this world would ever come looking for her. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but because she did not know what else to do with the unbearable weight of waiting. Behind her eyelids, she saw her mother's face, soft and tired, the way it had looked before the fever took her. She saw her father's hands, calloused from work, before the war took him too. She had crossed half a territory believing she was walking toward a family. Instead, she had found only an empty bench and a town that looked through her like glass. But somewhere on the road outside Blackwood, a quiet rancher was about to ride past the station and notice what no one else had dared to see. The promise had broken, though no one had said the words aloud. Julian Cross never came. No letter arrived to explain his absence, no rider, no apology. Grenda understood the truth slowly, the way frost creeps across a window. Julian Cross was never going to come. Her body kept score of the days. Hunger, cold, and disappointment settled into her shoulders like stones sewn into her dress. Still, some stubborn part of her remained on that bench, because leaving felt like admitting the truth. On the 3rd evening, the sky turned the color of a bruise, deep orange bleeding into purple. Grenda watched it without really seeing it, lost somewhere behind her own eyes. Then a small cloud of dust rose on the road leading into town. A rider, moving without hurry. She almost didn't look up. She had stopped expecting anyone. But something about the way the horse moved, steady, unbothered, as if its rider had nowhere urgent to be and yet knew exactly where he was going, made her lift her head. The man dismounted near the platform. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his skin sun-darkened from years of outdoor work. His eyes were a grey-blue, calm as still water. He didn't approach quickly. He didn't approach the way men sometimes approached her, with curiosity, with suspicion, with something uglier hiding underneath politeness. He simply looked at her, really looked. Her green skin and pointed ears meant nothing to him, not in a town like Blackwood, where orcs and humans had long shared the same dust and same hard living. But the sorrow in her eyes, that he could not ignore. Grenda braced herself for questions she had answered too many times already. "Where are you going? Who are you waiting for? Are you lost?" Instead, the man said only 2 words. "Come home." No explanation followed. No promise, no story, no demand. He turned and walked back toward his horse, leaving the choice entirely in her hands, as if he already understood that anything more would feel like another cage. Grenda sat frozen for a long moment, the words settling over her like rain after a drought. Home. She could not remember the last time anyone had offered her that word without conditions attached. Her legs ached as she rose. Hunger had hollowed her out, and 3 days of stillness had stiffened every muscle. Still, she gathered her small pouch, the only possession she had left, and took her first unsteady step away from the bench that had become her entire world. The station fell behind her, swallowed by dust and twilight. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth looking at, only a place that had watched her starve and called it none of their concern. The rancher walked his horse rather than ride, matching his pace to hers, without a word about it. Grenda followed a few steps behind, watching the back of a stranger she knew nothing about, trusting him with nothing but 2 quiet words and the desperate hope that, this time, a promise might actually be kept. The road stretched long and silent before them, swallowed slowly by the coming dark. The words "come home" repeated themselves in Grenda's mind with every step. It had been years since anyone offered her that word without wanting something in return. The phrase felt foreign on her tongue when she whispered it to herself, like a language she had once known and almost forgotten. Memories rose unbidden as she walked. Her father, broad-shouldered and patient, teaching her to mend a fence before the war took him from her. Her mother, growing thinner each week from a fever no medicine could touch, her hand cool and dry in Grenda's own during the final nights. Grief did not visit her gently. It arrived all at once, the way a storm arrives. Sudden, total, indifferent to whether she was ready. Nearly an hour passed before a property emerged from the darkness. A weathered fence marked its edges, leaning in places but standing. Beyond it sat a modest house, its windows glowing with soft lamplight. This was the rancher's land. He dismounted at the gate and opened it without a word, holding it just long enough for her to pass through. Then he waited. Grenda hesitated at the threshold of the house itself. It was not because she was an orc stepping into a human's home. Blackwood had long stopped caring about such things. It was because she had been turned away too many times to trust an open door without flinching. The man did not push her. He did not explain himself or insist. He simply held the door open, patient as stone, leaving the decision entirely hers to make. There was something in his stillness that steadied her more than words could have. She stepped inside. The house was simple, few furnishings, no decoration to speak of, but everything within it was clean, cared for, lived in with quiet dignity. A small fire crackled in the hearth, throwing warm light across the wooden floor. "Sit," he said, his first full word to her since the station. She obeyed, lowering herself into a chair near the fire as he moved toward the stove. Minutes later, he placed a bowl of stew in front of her, thick with vegetables, fragrant with herbs she didn't recognize. Hunger overpowered any hesitation. She ate quickly, gracelessly, too consumed by need to feel embarrassed by it. He said nothing, only refilled her cup with water and let her eat in peace. When the meal ended, he led her to a small room at the back of the house. A narrow bed waited there, the sheets clean and pulled tight. A basin of fresh water sat on a stand beside it, with folded towels nearby. He had prepared this room before he ever left to find her. "This is yours," he said simply, and then he left her alone with the door closed gently behind him. Grenda sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, simply breathing. The walls around her held no judgment, no suspicion, no eyes watching for a reason to turn her away. Her body remembered what safety felt like, a feeling she hadn't trusted in years. Before sleep finally claimed her, she pressed her palm flat against her chest and whispered a quiet thanks to whatever still listened to a woman like her. She did not know the rancher's name yet, but she knew somehow that she had been given something rare. She closed her eyes, and after 3 long days, sleep finally came without fear. Morning arrived gently, sunlight slipping through a thin curtain and warming the floorboards. For a few confused seconds, Grenda didn't know where she was. Then memory returned. The station, the road, the rancher, the open door, and a strange, unfamiliar lightness settled into her chest. She was safe. She let herself sit with that feeling, afraid that if she moved too quickly, it might shatter like ice on a pond. Beside the bed, she found a basin of clean water and a towel, still faintly warm, as though someone had refreshed it only minutes before she woke. No note, no explanation, just quiet evidence that someone had thought of her while she slept, and that small fact undid something tight in her chest that had been clenched for years. In the kitchen, fresh bread and warm milk waited on the table. Again, no note. Grenda understood the language being spoken to her anyway. It was a language she hadn't heard in a long time, the language of being thought of without being asked for anything in return. She ate slowly this time, savoring it, letting herself believe, just a little, that this might not vanish by nightfall. She found him near the fence line, already deep into his work, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his shirt darkened with sweat despite the early hour. He didn't pause for a greeting. He simply gave a small nod toward the tools resting against a post. An invitation, wordless and unforced. Grenda hesitated only a moment before picking up a pair of shears and kneeling near a patch of overgrown weeds. She did not ask if this was expected of her. She did not need to. Working felt better than standing still with her own unanswered fears, and for once her hands had a purpose that did not involve waiting for someone who would never come. They worked side by side through the morning, the silence between them comfortable rather than heavy. She found herself stealing glances at him, the careful, unhurried way he moved, the patience in his hands as he repaired a section of fence, never rushing, never frustrated. It was so unlike Julian Cross's restless charm, his hollow promises, dressed up as devotion. This man promised nothing, and yet somehow gave more. Doubt crept in anyway, the way it always did. Why would he want me here? What happens when he tires of feeding a stranger? When will he ask the question everyone eventually asks? What are you running from? She pushed the thoughts down, burying them beneath the rhythm of work, though they never fully disappeared. At midday, he brought her water without being asked, and they sat together on the porch, shoulders not quite touching. The quiet between them no longer felt like distance. It felt, strangely, like company. He studied the horizon, where clouds had begun gathering in heavy, bruised shapes. "Storm's coming," he said, his only words of the day. Yet they felt like an offering, a small thread of trust extended toward her. Grenda did not press him for more. She understood somehow that this man measured his words the way some men measured coin, sparingly and only when it mattered. She respected that. She, too, was not ready to spill her past into the open air. Not yet, not until she trusted that it wouldn't be used against her, the way her hope once had been. As the afternoon wore on, she realized something had shifted inside her, quietly, without ceremony. She did not feel like a burden waiting to be discovered, a feeling she hadn't known since her parents died. She felt, however fragile and new, like she belonged somewhere. Later that afternoon, while the rancher rode out to check on a fence line further from the house, Grenda allowed herself to explore. She moved carefully through the rooms, half expecting to be told she had overstepped, though no one was there to stop her. In a small side room, she found shelves crowded with books. Manuals on livestock and soil sat beside worn volumes of poetry, their spines cracked from years of gentle use. A book of hymns rested near the window, its pages soft with handling. She had not expected such things from a man who spoke in single sentences. There was a depth to him that his silence had been hiding all along. Tucked between two books, she found a photograph, its edges curling with age. A woman looked back at her, kind-eyed, soft-featured, her smile gentle even in stillness. Grenda did not know her name yet, but something about the photograph felt sacred, like a held breath she had no right to disturb. She placed it back exactly where she found it. Questions rose in her mind. Who was this woman and what had happened to her? But Grenda swallowed them. Some sorrows did not belong to strangers, not yet. She had learned, painfully, that grief deserved patience before it deserved curiosity. That night, the storm the rancher had predicted arrived in full force. Thunder cracked low and close, rattling the windows in their frames. Grenda woke with her heart hammering, momentarily lost in the dark before she remembered where she was. In the morning, she found a thick wool blanket folded neatly outside her door. Left sometime in the night, without a word, without acknowledgement. She understood immediately who had placed it there. He had heard the storm too, had thought of her shivering alone, and had done something about it rather than simply wondering. He continued to say little, but his actions spoke in a language louder than words. A second blanket appeared days later, a chair repaired without being asked. Small, quiet proofs that she was being watched over, not out of obligation, but out of something gentler. Exploring further, she discovered more traces of the woman from the photograph. A hairbrush still holding strands of light brown hair, a worn dress folded with care in a chest. The same hymn book she'd already noticed, its pages marked in places by a careful hand. The house remembered someone, even if its current occupant rarely spoke her name. Grenda understood, without being told, that someone deeply loved had once lived within these walls, and that her absence still occupied space here, the way silence occupies a room after a song ends. She recognized this kind of grief. It was the same grief she carried for her own mother, her own father. Loss did not discriminate between human hearts and orc hearts. It settled the same way in both. She thought of the woman often after that, never asking, never prying, simply holding the quiet knowledge that this house had survived heartbreak before and somehow still stood, still breathed, still offered warmth to strangers like her. If a place could carry love long after losing it, perhaps people could too. She began to understand the rancher a little more, not through his words, which remained few, but through the careful, devoted way he tended a home built around someone else's memory, and now, however cautiously, around hers. Grenda woke one morning with a quiet decision already settled in her chest. She wanted to give something back. The rancher had asked for nothing, expected nothing. Yet his kindness had filled her so completely that stillness no longer felt like enough. She began with the kitchen, scrubbing years of dust from shelves no one had thought to clean. She mended a curtain torn at the hem and swept the floors until they shone beneath the morning light. By midday, she had a simple meal simmering on the stove, nothing elaborate, just something warm and made with care. When the rancher returned that evening, he stopped at the doorway, taking in the changes slowly. The house looked different, brighter somehow, though nothing structural had changed. He said nothing of it directly, but Grenda noticed how his shoulders eased, how he breathed a little deeper, standing in a space that finally felt lived in again. Over dinner, he offered the first real comment he'd made since her arrival. "You don't sit still much," he said, not as criticism but as quiet observation. Grenda allowed herself a small smile, one that reached her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. Something between them began to loosen after that. The silence that once felt necessary started to feel optional instead, comfortable enough to break, comfortable enough to keep. She found herself watching him in the late afternoons, when he stood motionless at the edge of his fields, eyes fixed on something she couldn't see, as though listening to the land itself speak. Days passed in a gentle rhythm. Mornings brought work, afternoons brought small rest, evenings brought meals shared rather than eaten in solitude. He began leaving small things for her without ceremony. A ripe peach on the table, a tool repaired before she even noticed it had broken. Each gesture was quiet, but each one said the same thing. "I see you. I am thinking of you." Grenda stopped feeling like a guest passing through. She began to move through the house as though she belonged within its walls, and that feeling, fragile, unfamiliar, precious, grew a little stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, he returned from Blackwood carrying a small wooden box. Inside, she found a pair of sturdy leather boots, exactly her size, clearly chosen with thought rather than chance. Her old shoes had worn through weeks ago, though she had said nothing of it, too proud or too afraid to ask for anything more than she'd already been given. She held the boots for a long while, throat tight, unable to speak. He had noticed something she'd tried to hide. He had cared enough to fix it without being asked. That night, she prepared a full dinner: bread, roasted vegetables, meat seasoned carefully, a small dessert she'd found a recipe for tucked inside one of his late wife's old cookbooks. When he arrived home and found the table set with such care, he paused in the doorway again, the way he had days before, except this time something different moved across his face, something softer, something that looked almost like peace. They ate together slowly that night, the conversation still sparse, but warmer now, threaded with small laughs and shared glances. The house no longer felt haunted by absence, not the way it had for so long. It felt instead like it belonged to the people sitting inside it, quietly, carefully, becoming something close to a family. After the meal, the rancher sat back in his chair, studying the table Grenda had prepared with such quiet devotion. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his voice carried something new, genuine gratitude, unguarded and plain. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." The words settled over Grenda, gentle and unexpected. She realized in that moment she no longer wanted to be a nameless stranger in his home. She wanted to be known. "My name is Grenda," she said softly, the syllables feeling strange and brave on her tongue, as though she were introducing herself anew, free of everything she'd left behind. He held her gaze for a long moment, something shifting behind his quiet eyes. Then he offered the only thing he had left to give in return. "Cade," he said simply. It was such a small exchange, two names spoken aloud in a dim kitchen. And yet it felt enormous. They were no longer strangers, sharing a roof out of necessity. They were two people who had chosen, in their own quiet ways, to be known by each other. That night, Grenda sat outside beneath a wide spread of stars, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, hope that didn't ache. The future, for once, did not feel like something to fear. It felt, cautiously, like something worth waiting for. The peace didn't last. A few mornings later, dust rose along the distant road, not the gentle approach Cade had made weeks before, but something faster, more deliberate. Grenda's chest tightened the moment she saw it. Some instinct, sharpened by years of disappointment, told her this was trouble before she could even make out the riders' faces. Two men dismounted at the edge of the property. The older one carried himself with practiced authority, Mr. Thomas, though Grenda didn't yet know his name. Beside him rode a younger man, restless and sharp-eyed, his expression carrying open disdain the moment his gaze landed on her. "We're looking for an orc," Mr. Thomas said, his voice deceptively polite. "Matches your description exactly." Grenda's pulse pounded as recognition crept over her. These men had not come by accident. They knew who she was. "She's caused considerable trouble," Mr. Thomas continued smoothly. "A debt left unpaid. A groom abandoned at the altar, practically." His tone suggested sympathy for a victim that did not exist. The younger man, Jesse, sneered openly. "Orcs always run when it suits them," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. Grenda said nothing, frozen between fear and fury. The accusations twisted everything she had survived into something ugly and false, painting her as the villain in a story where she had only ever been left behind. She thought immediately of the name that had ruined her future once already, Julian Cross. Somehow, impossibly, his shadow had followed her even here, to the one place that had finally begun to feel safe. Behind her she heard the screen door creak open. Cade stepped onto the porch, his expression unreadable, his presence immediately changing the shape of the conversation. The two visitors straightened slightly, sensing for once that this conversation would not go as easily as they'd planned. Cade crossed the yard slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood beside Grenda rather than in front of her, a quiet statement that needed no explanation. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the rifle leaning near the doorframe. He simply stood, steady as the fence posts he mended each morning, and let his presence speak for him. Mr. Thomas tried again, his tone smooth as oiled leather. "This doesn't concern you, friend. We've simply come to collect what's owed." "She doesn't owe anyone here anything," Cade said, his voice low but unwavering. Jesse shifted in his saddle, emboldened by youth and impatience. "You don't even know her," he scoffed. "She's been running from her debts since Oakhaven, probably longer." Grenda felt the old fear rising. The fear of being defined entirely by someone else's lies. The fear that no matter how far she traveled, Julian Cross's betrayal would always find new mouths to repeat it through. She opened her mouth to defend herself, though the words tangled somewhere in her throat. She didn't need them. Cade spoke first. "She owes nothing," he repeated, each word deliberate, final. Silence stretched across the yard. Mr. Thomas's polished composure faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he searched for another angle, another lever to pull. He found none. Cade's stillness was its own kind of wall, immovable and unbothered by threats, dressed up as civility. After a long, tense moment, Mr. Thomas straightened his coat and forced a thin smile. "We'll be on our way then," he said, though something in his tone promised this wasn't truly finished. Jesse spat near the fence post before turning his horse, muttering something under his breath that neither Cade nor Grenda bothered to hear clearly. The two men rode off the way they'd come, dust rising behind them like a warning rather than a farewell. Grenda exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "They'll come back," she said quietly, more to herself than to Cade. He didn't argue. "Maybe," he admitted, "but not tonight." That evening, he reinforced the gate without being asked, tightening hinges and adding a second latch, working well past sunset by lamplight. Grenda watched him from the porch, understanding without needing to ask that he, too, believed this danger hadn't truly passed, only paused. When he finally finished, she walked toward him, her hand finding his forearm before she fully decided to reach for it. The gesture was small, almost involuntary, yet it carried the weight of everything she couldn't say aloud. Gratitude, fear, something warmer she hadn't allowed herself to name yet. Cade looked down at her hand, then up at her face, his expression softening in the lamplight. Neither of them spoke. The threat beyond the gate had not disappeared, but for this single moment, standing together in the quiet dark, it felt distant enough to bear. Above them, clouds gathered again at the edge of the horizon, slow and heavy, promising another storm before long. Grenda did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she no longer wanted to face it alone. Days later, while gathering firewood behind the barn, Grenda discovered a forgotten patch of land choked with weeds and tangled vines. Beneath the overgrowth, a wooden sign leaned sideways, its paint faded but still legible. Cora's garden. She understood immediately. This was the woman from the photograph, the gentle face she had found tucked between worn books weeks ago. Standing among the ruined flower beds, Grenda felt the full weight of what this house had carried long before she arrived. Cade's quiet devotion to memory suddenly made perfect sense. That night, she asked him gently about the garden, careful with her words. Aware she was touching something fragile, Cade went still for a long moment, old grief passing visibly across his face. But when he finally spoke, his answer was simple. You can restore it if you want. It wasn't permission given lightly. Grenda understood that. She spent the following days clearing stones, pulling weeds, coaxing life back into soil that had been neglected far too long. Each handful of dirt felt like an act of respect rather than labor, a way of honoring a woman she had never met, but somehow understood. When the work was finally done, color had returned to the small plot. Wildflowers, herbs, a few vegetables pushing eagerly toward the sun. Cade walked out one morning and found something new beside the old sign. A second one freshly carved, resting beside the first. Grenda's garden. She pressed her palm against the smooth wood, eyes stinging, unable to find words large enough for what the gesture meant. Not long after, the sky darkened with a storm fiercer than any before it. Wind tore at the fences, rain fell in heavy sheets, and thunder shook the windows in their frames. Cade and Grenda rushed together into the rain, fighting to secure the frightened animals before the worst of it arrived. In the chaos, Grenda's foot slid in the mud, and she nearly fell. Cade caught her without hesitation, his arms steady around her, rain streaming down both their faces as lightning lit the sky above them. For one long moment, neither moved, breathless not just from exertion, but from the closeness neither had allowed themselves before. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. But another storm remained unresolved. The threat of Julian Cross, of debts that weren't hers, of men who might return at any time. Grenda considered, painfully, whether leaving might be the only way to protect Cade from the danger she seemed to carry with her wherever she went. She had spent a sleepless night turning the thought over, wondering if love meant staying or meant walking away before she caused him more harm. By morning, she understood the truth. Running had never solved anything. It had only delayed the moment she finally had to choose herself and the people willing to stand beside her. She chose to stay. Weeks passed peacefully after that, the threats fading like distant thunder that never quite returns. The garden bloomed fully by summer's end, fragrant and alive, gentle, enduring, impossible to forget, the way Cora's memory had always lived within these walls. One quiet afternoon, Cade carried a final wooden sign to the front gate. hammering it into place beside the worn fence Grenda had once hesitated to cross. She watched him work, her heart full in a way she had never known it could be. The sign read simply, "Home of G and C." Grenda stood beside him in the fading golden light, the wind soft against her face, the garden breathing quietly behind them. For the first time in her life, she was no longer waiting for someone to arrive. She had already found him. She had already found home. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.